The restaurant didn't fall silent because Hannah Parker sang, it fell silent because the man who stepped out of the shadows behind her had the kind of power that made an entire room forget how to breathe. A lone birthday candle shook on the table of an elderly woman crying into her hands, and Hannah's skin went hot with the same instinct that says, run before your mind can explain why. She turned and met Gideon Cross's eyes cold, assessing her like a mistake that couldn't be undone. Then the woman whispered his name like a confession, and Hannah understood too late. She hadn't just sung for a stranger. She'd just lit a fuse in the Mafia boss's world. If this grabbed you, hit like, share it with someone who loves high-stakes romance, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. No one in the restaurant dared to breathe too loudly anymore. Behind Hannah, the silence wasn't an empty space but an invisible discipline, as if the whole room had just been placed under an unspoken vow. Hannah could hear her own heartbeat hammering against her ribs, could hear the tiny candle on table 12 tremble under the breath of the air conditioning, could even hear the fabric of her apron rasp against her hip as she tried to step back, but she couldn't. Her body locked in place while her mind scattered, hunting for an exit the way it had done her entire life. She thought of the kitchen door. She thought of the narrow hallway in back where no one looked at her. She thought of disappearing. Then a hand settled on the back of the old woman's chair, very lightly, but with enough force that everything around them seemed pressed down by another layer. Gideon Cross didn't roar. He didn't shout. He didn't make a spectacle. He simply stood there, tall, terrifyingly calm, and leaned toward Marianne like a son checking whether his mother was cold. His voice was low, steady, polite as steel wrapped in velvet. "Are you okay, Mom?" Marianne wiped her tears with the back of her hand, trying to smile through broken breaths. "I'm okay. I just didn't expect." Gideon looked at the burning candle, looked at the small slice of cake, then looked straight into his mother's reddened eyes. There was no reproach in that gaze, only absolute attention, as if he were memorizing every detail to make sure no one had the right to hurt his mother, not even loneliness. Marianne squeezed his hand once, weak but decisive, as if to say none of this was his fault. Only then did Gideon turn to Hannah. That single movement made Hannah feel as though a heavy door had swung on its hinges, making no sound and yet being felt by everyone. His eyes settled on her, unhurried, unwavering. Hannah felt herself shrink inside her uniform, felt both hands cling to the tray as if it were a plank in churning water. He didn't ask what she was doing. He didn't ask why she dared. He only asked her name, a simple question. But to Hannah, it weighed like a sentence, because it meant he'd decided she had to exist within his sight. "Hannah Parker?" she stammered, her voice gone rough, then rushed to add, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean. She didn't know what the right words were. Every syllable in her mouth could turn into wrong. She thought the manager would drag her into the storage room, scold her, fire her, or worse, that some hand would clamp around her elbow and steer her out the back door the way people remove a problem. She saw Owen Mercer behind Gideon, silent, composed, eyes unblinking like a recording device. Owen didn't need to do anything. Just standing there was enough to make Hannah understand this wasn't a normal family. This was a world with its own laws, and she'd stepped over a boundary without realizing it. Gideon received her apology the way you receive an unnecessary sound. He tilted his head the slightest amount, not out of curiosity, but as if correcting a misalignment. "Don't apologize," he said, in English, clear, clipped, not raised. "Don't apologize." It didn't sound like forgiveness. It sounded like an order, a way of resetting the air, as if he didn't want her to throw that weakness into the middle of this room. Hannah shut her mouth at once. She felt her throat close, as if one more sound would crack her open. Marianne looked at Hannah, her gaze softening, something like gratitude and pity blending together. She meant to say something, but Gideon had already placed a hand on her shoulder, very lightly, in reassurance. He murmured a few words to his mother too quietly for anyone else to catch, then straightened. He didn't look around for agreement. He didn't need it. But before he left, he swept a glance across the dining room, across the faces, pretending to focus on their plates, across the employees frozen like statues. There was no rage in that look, only a cold message. Tonight everyone had seen, and tonight everyone would forget the right way. The door opened. A gust of cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of rain and the night street. Gideon guided Marianne out, Owen following like a loyal shadow. When the door closed, the background music seemed to dare return, cautious as someone who'd just witnessed something that didn't belong to ordinary life. Hannah still stood there, hands shaking, the tray heavy as stone. She didn't understand why she was still here. She only understood one thing with a numb, unmistakable clarity. Being noticed by a man like Gideon Cross wasn't like any kind of attention she'd ever feared or ever craved. It wasn't just a look. It was weight. It was a mark. And once that mark was pressed into place, it would drag danger behind it the way a shadow follows a footstep. After Gideon Cross left Belamonte, and the door shut like a latch, sealing the air in place, Hannah stayed frozen for a few more beats, then forced her legs to move, as if the floor had suddenly tilted, and every stair had gained weight. She carried the tray like a machine, answered small, broken questions with meaningless syllables, and in her head there was only one short line: "Don't apologize." That sentence clung to her like ink that hadn't dried yet, making her want to believe it was mercy while knowing it was a warning. She stepped into the staff area, washed her hands longer than usual, watched the water slide through her fingers, as if she were trying to scrub away a moment that had brushed against something that didn't belong to her. But the harder she tried to forget, the more her memory pushed back. And then, like a sharp turn, the story didn't pull Hannah back to what had just happened. It dragged her to earlier that afternoon, when everything still hadn't smelled like danger, when she was still a shadow who knew how to slip through other people's lives without leaving footprints. That day Hannah came in for her shift earlier than usual, not because she was eager, but because she believed arriving early was the only way to make sure she didn't make a mistake, make sure no one had to wait for her, make sure there would never be another late arrival again. She went around to the back entrance, the alley damp with the smell of old brick and wet trash, pushed open the metal door with its protesting squeal, and slipped into the narrow corridor leading to the changing room, where fluorescent lights bleached people's skin, and everything looked as if it were coated in fatigue. Hannah hung up her coat, tied her hair back neatly, then fastened her apron around her waist, a small act she always did slowly, like a ritual, as if that string didn't just hold fabric. It held her existence inside a safe order, a thin layer of armor, just enough for her to step onto the floor without anyone remembering her name, just enough for her to glide past her coworkers' laughter, past weekend stories, past the measuring looks she always avoided the way you avoid a blade. And right as the two ends of the apron string tightened, an old image snapped into her mind. Without warning, without permission, a hospital hallway under harsh white lights, the smell of disinfectant clinging to her hair and clothes like a curse, footsteps of passing people echoing in an empty way, and her phone vibrating in her pocket like a small creature trying to bite into her skin, the screen flashing an unfamiliar number. She'd seen it, but she hadn't answered, because her hands were full of flour and sugar during the earlier shift. Because she thought she'd call back in 10 minutes. Because she'd believed 10 minutes couldn't steal anyone away. But 10 minutes did exactly that. She remembered running through the doors, breathless, her hair coming loose. Her hands remained ice cold despite the warmth of the hospital. Then, she heard the nurse's voice, fading like water running into the distance. She heard the way you hear water running farther and farther away. And she remembered the moment she opened the room, saw the white bed, saw the silent monitor, saw her grandmother's face resting still as if she'd gone somewhere she no longer needed to wait for Hannah to arrive. She was the only person who had ever called Hannah home, who had ever said Hannah wasn't an object passed from hand to hand. Hannah was a child who had the right to be loved, and yet on the day she was needed, Hannah arrived late by only a few minutes. Only a few minutes, but enough to change a life. That memory didn't return as a long scene. It was a flash that made her heart clamp tight, made her throat seize as if she'd swallowed a stone, and made her understand why she lived by disappearing. Because if no one saw her, she couldn't disappoint anyone. If no one expected her, she couldn't be late. Hannah drew a deep breath, pressed the memory down the way you press a sheet of paper to the bottom of a drawer, then stepped out onto the floor on time, worked with a level of care so intense, people mistook it for coldness, until she saw Gideon Cross, the older woman with neatly kept silver hair, a beige coat, sitting alone at table 12 like a small period of loneliness in the middle of laughter. In front of her was a small piece of cake and a candle she had lit herself, the flame trembling, weak but not going out. Hannah had meant to walk past the way she always did, meant to do her function and withdraw, but that image yanked hard on the wound inside her. An older woman sitting alone in front of a candle, a moment that should have had someone beside her. And all Hannah could hear wasn't the restaurant but the clock in the hospital, the sound of her own late footsteps, the sound of the door opening too late. She stopped, just for a beat. But for someone who lived by disappearing, stopping was a dangerous act. Hannah felt her hands go cold, then hot, felt her eyes burn, and in that moment, she understood that if she kept walking, she would live one more day the way she always had, safe, invisible, unremembered. But she would carry one more late arrival with her, one more silence in front of a lonely candle, and she couldn't bear it. So she chose what she had never chosen before. She stopped instead of disappearing. After the moment she chose to stop instead of disappearing, everything happened so fast that Hannah felt as if she'd been thrown out of a quiet place and into the middle of a highway. But when the door closed behind Gideon Cross and Owen Mercer, Belamonte's background music came back too, like someone who'd just been allowed to breathe. The soft clink of knives and forks, the gentle touch of glass against glass, laughter trying to find its normal rhythm again. Only Hannah couldn't return to what she'd been before. For her, the sounds were no longer whole. They felt squeezed smaller, compressed into a narrow tube that made everything distant and warped. She moved between the tables like a shadow held too close to a light, every step controlled with careful restraint, every breath held inside her chest as if she were afraid of making noise. Her hands held the tray and still trembled, not strongly enough for everyone to see, but enough for her to feel her body betraying her. She avoided looking straight at the guests, not because they were frightening, but because she was afraid she'd find that same cold in someone else's eyes. Afraid she'd realize that from now on she'd been placed in a corner she couldn't pull herself out of. And just as she meant to slip into the back again to wash her hands one more time, Sienna Walsh appeared like a door shutting fast. The floor manager didn't raise her voice, didn't panic, but her sharp eyes flicked over Hannah once, enough for Hannah to know Sienna had seen everything. Sienna took Hannah lightly by the wrist and guided her into the storage room and back, where the smell of roasted coffee and cardboard mingled with the chill of the ice machine. The storage door closed, and the restaurant noise was cut down at once into a muted hum, and Sienna spoke plainly, practically, like someone laying down rules of survival instead of offering advice. Tonight you don't say his name. You don't ask. You don't explain. Hannah swallowed hard, tried to nod, but her throat felt cinched by her apron string. She heard that sentence, and felt as if she'd been handed a life preserver, and warned at the same time that if she flailed the wrong way, it would sink. Sienna leaned back against the shelf, her eyes never leaving Hannah, then added in a lower voice, not to threaten her, but to make her understand the scale of it. In Chicago, there are people who only have to walk through a door, and the whole city's schedule shifts. No one gives orders in public, but everyone knows they have to stay quiet. They have to avoid, they have to forget what they saw. And if someone like that looks at you once, don't try to turn it into a story you retell. Let it die right in your mouth. Hannah felt the skin at the back of her neck go cold. She wanted to ask why, wanted to ask what would happen if she didn't stay silent, but she didn't dare, because inside her was another fear even deeper, the fear that the moment she opened her mouth to ask, she would be admitting she'd been seen, admitting she was pulling herself out of the dark. Sienna saw that panic and let out a tired breath, as if she'd watched too many people ruin their own lives, with one sentence they thought was harmless. Then Sienna placed a bottle of water in Hannah's hand. Drink, then go back to work, normal as any other day, and remember, if anyone asks, you were just working? Hannah nodded again, her head still buzzing, then opened the storage door and stepped out. The restaurant lights hit her and made her eyes sting. She returned to the floor with a small smile that was just professional enough, but inside she felt as if she were walking on glass. And when she carried her tray past the front entrance, something strange yanked at her attention, as if someone were measuring distance. She glanced quickly at the decorative mirror near the host stand and saw two unfamiliar men standing by the door. They didn't look like dinner guests. They weren't smiling. They weren't studying a menu. They weren't talking to each other with any easy intimacy. They were simply there, dark coats, hands resting loosely in their pockets, eyes scanning the room as if counting the rhythm of someone who would arrive or someone who would leave. Hannah lowered her gaze at once, her heart pounding harder. She told herself, maybe they were security, maybe they were just customers waiting for a table, maybe she was being too sensitive. But the truth was, in the way they stood still and yet changed the air, the way Gideon had, only they didn't carry the power of a name, they carried the coldness of a task. Hannah walked past, trying to keep her breathing even, but every step felt heavier, and she understood one thing that was more frightening than the fact that she'd sung or that she'd stopped. Danger wasn't in the action that had already happened. Danger was in the fact that from now on, someone might start paying attention to her, and once a man like Gideon Cross had looked at her, others in his world could look at her too, in a way that wasn't gentle at all. Hannah tried to do exactly what Sienna had told her, tried to let everything die in her mouth. But that night stretched on like a road with no turns, and every time she passed the front door, the eyes of those two unfamiliar men seemed to touch the back of her shirt, not a touch anyone could see, but the kind that made the back of her neck go cold. She served tables, took orders, poured water, smiled with proper restraint, and lived by an old, worn rule: don't let anyone remember you. Only now that rule felt like a thin coat worn in a snow wind. Not enough anymore, because there were people who didn't need her to draw attention. They could still pay attention. Near the end of her shift, Sienna called Hannah up to the host stand to help check bills, like a way to keep her where there were brighter lights and more people coming and going. Hannah stood there holding a stack of papers, her eyes sliding over numbers she couldn't truly read, until she saw a small envelope tucked into the tip book, the paper folded neatly, with no sign of haste, as if whoever wrote it already knew it would reach her. Hannah opened it, and inside there wasn't money but a thin slip of paper, a few Spanish words written carefully, like the handwriting of someone who had time and patience. "Thank you, child." And then one short line that made Hannah's throat tighten at once. "You reminded me that I'm still here." That was all. No show, no flourish, but it struck Hannah like a door opening straight into the softest part of her. Because all her life Hannah had been used to being seen only when she did something wrong, when she was in the way, when she became a burden, and this time, a stranger had seen her for something gentle and asked for no payment at all. Hannah held the note, her fingertips trembling a little, her eyes stinging. She had to bend her head and pretend to recheck the bills just to hide the emotion rising in her throat. She couldn't remember the last time someone had thanked her in a way that didn't come with the unspoken word, but meaning obligation. She felt something warm begin to open in her chest, slowly, like a small flame that didn't burn, but did light the dark. And just when she thought tonight might end with that little bit of light, a man's voice sounded right behind her. Very close, but not rough, like a greeting scrubbed clean of feeling. "Miss Hannah Parker." Hannah turned and saw Owen Mercer standing there, still as composed as he'd been at Gideon's side, his coat smooth, his hair neatly combed, his eyes so calm they made the person facing him feel messy. He didn't look threatening in the way men who shout do, but his politeness tightened Hannah more, because politeness in this world wasn't always kindness. Owen looked at the Spanish note in Hannah's hand, then looked up at her face. He didn't snatch it away, didn't ask anything personal. He simply said, in a voice like he was checking a line on a form, "What time do you get off?" Hannah swallowed, glanced around the host stand as if searching for Sienna, but Sienna was down at the far end of the floor talking to a VIP guest. Hannah answered softly, "Close to midnight." Owen nodded, then asked again, "How do you get home?" Hannah felt her stomach tighten. The question sounded like concern, and yet it also felt like a key being tried in a lock. She said she walked to the train station, sometimes took a ride, depending on the night. Owen listened as if filing it away, then tilted his head, his voice still mild. "What area do you live in?" Hannah gave a vague answer. "Near Logan Square." Owen offered a very slight smile. Not a happy smile, only a sign that he had enough of what he needed. Hannah tried to keep her voice normal and asked, "Is something wrong?" Owen looked straight at her, and in that moment Hannah understood why Gideon chose a man like this to stand beside him, because Owen could turn fear into a gentle sentence. He didn't circle the point. "No one wants what happened tonight to become something other people can tell. We just want to make sure you get home safe." That line could have been kindness, or it could have been a reminder that they knew exactly when she went home. Hannah felt as if the warm flame in her chest had just been covered by a cold hand. The bait and switch came too fast. Marianne's tenderness hadn't even had time to settle before the scent of control slid over it like a sheet of glass. Owen continued, his voice lower, like a truth about the city. "Chicago isn't gentle with people who get noticed." Hannah heard that, and saw all the strange eyes near the door, all the unnatural silence, all of Gideon's final sweep of a glance, suddenly linked together into a straight line leading to her. She nodded, not sure what she was agreeing to, only knowing that resisting right now would be a kind of noise. Owen stepped back, polite as if he'd just asked about the weather, then said, "Finish your work. When you get off, Someone will be outside to make sure no one bothers you." Hannah stayed still, the Spanish note in her hand somehow lighter and heavier at the same time, because it was proof she'd managed to touch one human being, and also a sign she'd left a trace in a world that didn't forgive traces. And when Owen walked away from the host stand, Hannah watched him, saw him pass the two unfamiliar men near the door, and with a single small nod, they shifted their positions at once, like chess pieces moved into the right squares. And in that moment, Hannah understood more clearly than any warning could have said. Tonight wasn't only a moving moment. Tonight was a trace that had been recorded. And that trace wouldn't vanish, just because she wanted to go back to being a shadow. Gideon Cross drove his mother home in silence. Not the empty kind of silence, but the silence of a man measuring every edge of what had just happened, and trying to find where it had tilted the order of things. Marianne sat in the back seat, her hands still trembling slightly from emotion, holding her small purse tight against her chest as if she could keep something warm there. And Gideon drove neither fast nor slow, eyes fixed on the road, his jaw set just enough for Owen Mercer to understand that tonight he shouldn't say anything beyond what was necessary. Owen gave a brief report that he'd left men outside the restaurant, that the exits had been controlled, then stopped. Because in Gideon's world, extra words were the kind of thing that tangled the signal. When the car stopped in front of Marianne's house, Gideon helped her out, pulled her coat into place, asked only one question in a low voice. "Are you okay, Mom?" Marianne nodded, looked at her son as if she wanted to say more, then chose instead to touch her hand to his cheek. That touch held Gideon still for one beat, longer than usual. Then she said, "That girl sang like people can still be kind just because they want to." Gideon didn't answer. He only bent and kissed his mother's forehead. And after Marianne was inside and the door had closed, Gideon turned back to the car, his face returning to the unreadable calm the whole city had learned to fear. Gideon's penthouse sat high above the streets, wide glass, city lights spread out like a cold sea of stars. He walked in, took off his coat, loosened the cuff buttons, poured liquor into a crystal glass. The amber liquid spun once and settled. He lifted the glass, but didn't drink. The liquor was emotion, not a need. He watched it for a moment, the way a man watches a familiar equation, then set it down, and inside his head, the rule he'd lived by for too long began to speak again. Everything is a transaction, because transactions can be predicted. No one gives anyone anything for free. Kindness always comes with a bill. It's just that sometimes the bill is hidden better, and yet tonight a waitress had sung for his mother as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She hadn't looked around for praise, hadn't looked to him for permission, hadn't tried to drag any benefit toward herself. That kind of kindness unsettled Gideon in a strange way. Like one wrong note inside a perfect piece of music. He walked to his desk, turned on the monitor, called Owen into the room. Owen appeared at once, standing at the proper distance, not too close to invade the boss's space, not too far to be taken as disrespect. Gideon didn't look at Owen. He only said a name. Hannah Parker, his voice even, like he was calling an item on a list. Owen answered immediately. "I've got the basics," Gideon continued. "Find out about her. All of it. But listen carefully. No threats. No contact. Don't let her know. No one touches her." Owen's brow tightened just slightly, like a man used to receiving hard orders. Then he nodded, understood. Gideon still faced the screen, the blue light sharpening his cheekbones, making him look colder. But his voice held no anger, only absolute control. "I don't want her to become a story in anyone's mouth." Owen caught the message underneath. Not because Gideon cared about the waitress, but because anything that touched his mother had to be protected from people who would twist it into leverage. Owen left, and minutes later, the data appeared on the screen, like papers laid out in straight lines. Gideon read quickly. Name, age, rental address, work history, nothing glittering, nothing anyone would call an alluring mystery. Only a life with broken segments. The file looked like a book with too many pages torn out. Hannah had moved often, changed schools often. There were gaps with no explanation. No relatives listed under emergency contact. No one stepping forward as a sponsor. No network. No foundation. Only a chain of addresses and low-paying jobs. As if she existed without permission to take root, Gideon stopped at an old medical note. A single line about a guardian who had died. Grandmother. Then, another line about Hannah working continuously during that period. Gideon stared at those lines longer than he needed to, not out of cheap curiosity, but because he recognized a kind of loneliness he'd thought belonged only to his own world. Not loneliness from having no one around you, but loneliness from having no one who truly belongs to you. He remembered the way she stood like she wanted to vanish even after she'd sung. Remembered her eyes wide with fear, and remembered what his mother had said. People can still be kind just because they want to. Gideon blinked, as if pulling himself back from a thought that didn't fit the rules. He turned the screen off for a beat, looked toward the untouched glass of liquor, and right then his phone vibrated on the desk. A message from an unsaved number. Only 3 short words. Nice song. Gideon stared at the line the way a man stares at a new crack in glass. He didn't need to ask who sent it, because in this city, people bold enough to text like that usually had only one reason. They'd seen, and when they'd seen, they'd want what they'd seen to become leverage. Gideon set the phone down very slowly, as if one sharp movement might be enough to spread something dangerous that was beginning to take shape. The next day, Hannah went to work feeling like she was stepping into a room where the floor could give way at any moment. She tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw an invisible message line running across her life, saw Gideon Cross's cold stare, saw Marianne's softened smile in that rare moment, then heard Owen's voice saying, "Chicago isn't gentle with people who get noticed." Hannah arrived early, still used the back door, still tied her apron like she was cinching a vow, and told herself that if she just did things right, stayed quiet, and no one mentioned last night, everything would pass like a trail of smoke. But the truth for someone who'd lived in the foster care system was that she understood better than anyone that some trails of smoke don't disappear. They just move. The shift drifted along in its normal rhythm. Sienna was sharp as always, still watched Hannah for one extra beat before turning away as if reminding her to keep her mouth shut. And Hannah did. She didn't say anyone's name, didn't retell anything. She just worked. Until late in the afternoon, with no warning noise, no entourage, no Owen beside him. The air in the restaurant suddenly changed, as if someone had lowered a sheet of glass. Hannah didn't even have time to understand why before she saw him. Gideon sitting in a shadowed corner near the wall of framed paintings, where the warm yellow light didn't hit his face directly. He wore a dark coat, his shirt cuffs showing neat and clean. He wasn't looking around like a curious customer. He was simply there, still, as if that seat had belonged to him for a long time, and Hannah felt her stomach tighten instantly, a reflex that didn't need a reason. Her steps slowed, her hands clamped around the tray until her fingertips went white. She braced for a reckoning, for a question about last night, for a quiet punishment more frightening than shouting. But Gideon didn't order liquor, didn't order food. He only lifted a hand, signaled to the nearby server, and said one low word, "Water." Just water, then sat back in silence as if he hadn't come to eat dinner but to test something inside himself. Hannah tried to push herself away, tried to let a coworker take his table, but Sienna looked at her from across the room with a short, decisive glance, a wordless command. Hannah understood. This was hers. She walked toward him, each step like crossing a zone of exposed wiring, and when she reached the table, she dipped her head the way servers always do, kept her voice as normal as she could. "Good evening. Sir, what can I get you?" Gideon looked up. His eyes weren't as cold as they'd been last night. But that was almost worse, because they were too calm, as if he'd already decided what he would ask, and no emotion would be allowed to bend it. He didn't answer her question, didn't mention his mother, didn't mention the restaurant's silence. He asked only one thing. "What was that song?" Hannah froze a little. She hadn't expected that. She'd prepared herself for a dozen other things, and this question felt like a key turning in a drawer she kept locked. She swallowed and said it was a Mexican birthday song. She said the title in a voice so small she seemed afraid the syllables would make someone turn and look. Then Gideon asked, "Why do you know Spanish?" The question was short, neither soft nor hard, just direct. Hannah felt her throat dry out. She could have told him everything. About her grandmother, about the years of being passed around, about a Mexican neighbor long ago, who'd taught her a few phrases so she could greet people and not feel lost. About how Spanish for her wasn't decoration. It was a thin string tying her to a time when someone had called her by her name. But Hannah wasn't used to laying her insides out on a dining table, so she answered half true and half hidden, that her grandmother had once known a Mexican neighbor. That neighbor used to talk with her in Spanish, and Hannah had listened and learned a few phrases. And last night it had only been. She stopped, searched for a word, then said in a rough voice, "I just didn't want her blowing out her candle alone." That sentence fell like a coin into a cup of water. Simple but ringing. Gideon didn't react right away. He looked at her for a long time, so long Hannah thought she'd said the wrong thing. Thought it sounded like foolish interference. Thought he would ask why she'd dared to decide something for someone else. But Gideon only stayed silent, and inside that silence was something uneasy and strange, as if he were trying to fit the trembling waitress in front of him to the invisible strength of an act that demanded nothing. Finally, he set the water glass down and said very quietly, almost only for her, "I won't let this blow back on you." His voice didn't carry romance, only the cold certainty of a man who was used to controlling consequences. Hannah didn't know what to say. She only nodded like a machine and turned away, walking from his table with the feeling that his gaze still held the back of her shoulders. And when she passed the front windows on her way to the station to get more water, she glanced outside without meaning to and saw a dark car parked at the curb, not the kind of car that drops off dinner guests who hurry in and then leave. It sat there like it was waiting, like it was watching, and the most frightening part was that it had been there long enough for Hannah to understand that tonight someone was truly counting her steps. The rain started in the afternoon, and by evening it thickened like a heavy curtain dropped over Chicago, turning streetlights into long smeared streaks and softening every sound. But for Hannah, that night wasn't soft. It was sharp and cold as the edge of glass. She tried to finish her shift, as if everything were normal, tried not to look out the windows, but every time she passed the large front pane, the image of that dark car was still there, like a tack driven into her eye, not blinking, not hurrying, just existing, and the longer it existed, the more it became a question no one answered. When the clock at the host stand ticked toward midnight, the guests thinned out. Hannah wiped tables, refolded napkins, returned trays to the kitchen like someone cleaning up a day in the hope it might disappear. Sienna still let her leave on time, only looked at her once as if asking, "Are you okay?" But Hannah didn't want to open her mouth, because she feared that if she said it out loud, her fear would take on a clearer shape. She changed in the staff room, tied her hair back again, pulled her coat up around her throat, then stepped out the back door, the alley damp with the smell of rain and wet trash, wind slapping her face until her eyes stung. Hannah walked fast toward the corner, her heart beating like a drum struck off rhythm, not because she was certain someone was watching her, but because her body had learned to panic before her mind had time to verify. She glanced across the street and saw the dark car still there, not close enough for her to read a plate, but not so far it could be innocent either. The windows were tinted, no faces visible inside, only a thick block of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. Hannah told herself it might just be someone's car waiting for a friend. It might be a delivery driver. It might be any harmless explanation. A person who wanted peace would invent so she didn't go insane, but her feet still moved faster, as if the pavement itself were tilting toward danger. She cut down a short side stretch to reach the main street, where there were more people, more lights, more witnesses, and just when she thought she could melt into the flow of passing cars, a voice came from the opposite side, not loud, not threatening, only solid, like an order from someone used to giving orders. "Hannah." She snapped around and saw Gideon Cross standing under the awning of a building across from her, rain falling in strings off the shoulders of his dark coat, his hair damp at his temples, but his eyes dry, alert, as if he'd calculated every step of tonight in advance. He didn't rush toward her like a savior. He didn't call her name to turn it into a romantic story. He only glanced past her shoulder once, just enough for Hannah to know he saw that car too. Then he said it straight. "Get in, not because I'm kind, because it's safer." The words were cold but clear, and they made Hannah hesitate because they promised nothing except truth. Hannah looked toward the dark car, then looked back at Gideon. She didn't want to owe him, didn't want to step deeper into his world, didn't want her name sitting in anyone else's mouth. But the rain was cold, the street was thinning, and that car still didn't move. It held itself there like a question being kept on purpose. Hannah hesitated for one beat. Then fear won. She hurried after Gideon, her shoes slipping slightly on the wet pavement. He opened a car door, not the dark one across the street, but a sedan parked tight to the curb, clean and discreet. Hannah slid into the back seat by instinct, both hands immediately closing around her bag strap, squeezing until her knuckles whitened, as if she let go she would drift out of herself. The door shut, and the sound of the rain dropped at once. The world outside turned into water streaks on glass. Inside the car there was warmth, the smell of leather seats and rain clinging to Gideon's coat. He sat in front, hands on the wheel, didn't turn to look at her right away, as if giving her a breath of space. Then he pulled away slowly, not rushing, not showing off, as if the simple fact of the car moving at the right moment was already a message. Hannah stared through the rear window, trying to see whether the dark car moved, but all she saw were streetlights and rain. Her heart was still racing, but her breathing began to find its rhythm again. Gideon didn't speak for the first few minutes. Didn't ask where she lived. Didn't ask what she was afraid of. He just drove, and that silence eased Hannah more than questions ever would, because she was used to people who asked in order to take information, while Gideon's silence felt like a wall blocking the wind. Then, when the car turned onto a quieter street, Gideon finally asked, his voice low, like a needle finding the softest place. "Who taught you to disappear?" Hannah jolted. Because the question wasn't about the car, wasn't about tonight, it was about her whole life. She opened her mouth to say no one, to say she was just shy, to say she simply didn't like causing trouble, but those words sounded like lies even in her own ears. Hannah looked down at her, hands still crushing the strap, at her nails biting into her skin, and she understood Gideon had seen what most people never saw, that her invisibility wasn't a cute habit, it was a survival skill. Hannah didn't answer all the way, because she wasn't used to telling, because telling meant admitting the wound was real. She only said one short line, her voice rough as if full of grit. "It's what you learn when no one comes back." That sentence fell into the car like a stone dropped into deep water. Gideon didn't reply, but Hannah saw his hand tighten slightly on the wheel, an involuntary reaction, and in that moment, even though they still sat separated by 2 rows of seats and a stretch of silence, Hannah felt the distance between them change. Not closer in any intimate way, but closer in the way 2 people do when they've just touched the same loneliness, the kind you don't have to reach for with your hands to feel it pass through you, cold and hot at the same time. Gideon didn't drive Hannah straight home the way a polite man would, just to end it and be done. He looped through streets, washed in light, and then turned gradually toward higher roads, where the city opened beneath them like a map that breathed in light. Hannah didn't ask where they were going, because she was afraid any question would pull them into something more binding, more defined. And Gideon didn't explain either. He only drove, calm, certain, as if the night roads were part of his own body. Then the car stopped at a quiet overlook above the city, where a cold metal railing waited, and the wind carried the smell of rain. Below them, Chicago stretched out, ribbons of headlights like bloodlines, tall buildings like ribs, everything alive and yet far, far enough that you could look without being swallowed. Gideon got out first, leaned against the railing, didn't smoke, didn't perform any gesture meant to look dangerous. He simply stood there, and his power was still present like gravity that didn't need to show itself. Hannah stepped out after him, pulled her coat tight up around her neck. The cold bit into her skin, but it also cleared her head. She stood at a distance from Gideon that was just enough not to become intimate, and just enough not to become running away. And the 2 of them looked down at the city for a long time without speaking. Wind slipped through Hannah's hair, bringing damp and metal, and in that quiet Hannah realized something strange. Up here she didn't feel as afraid as she had in the restaurant, maybe because there were no other eyes, no clatter of forks, no men stationed at the door, only a gray sky and a distant city. Gideon broke the silence first, but not with anything sweet. He asked in a low voice, almost emotionless, "Rocold, you're still thinking about it, aren't you?" Hannah understood he wasn't asking about the dark car or the rainy night. He was asking about what she'd said in the car, about no one coming back. Hannah swallowed, looked down at her hands buried in her coat pockets, then spoke the truth she always avoided. She spoke of her grandmother without calling her grandmother at first, as if saying the right name would hurt more. She said there had been someone who once called her home, someone who held her in a world that was always trying to push her away, and she'd believed that if she tried hard enough, if she did enough things right, she wouldn't lose that person. Hannah gave a very small smile, not a happy one, then spoke of the hospital day, not as a long story, only in fragments, the bright white hallway, the phone vibrating, the minutes she thought she still had, and the moment she stepped into the room and everything was already quiet. She spoke as if paying a debt that had sat on her chest for years. "I was late, only a few minutes, but those few minutes were enough for me to lose her." and I told myself that if I got good enough at disappearing, no one would ever have to wait for me again. Hannah's voice trembled on the last word. She turned her face away so the wind could take some of the wetness from her eyes. Gideon listened without interrupting, without telling her not to blame herself, because those lines are usually hollow to someone carrying guilt. He was silent in the way of a man who knows pain doesn't need advice. Then he said the thing that surprised Hannah most. Not comfort, but a truth about himself. "I don't believe in kindness," Gideon said, his voice flat as water before a storm. Not because he wanted to sound hard, but because it was the belief that had kept him alive. Everything has a bill. Everyone wants something, even when they smile. He turned his head and looked at Hannah, his gaze dark and clear. Then continued, "But last night, I couldn't find your price. It didn't sound like praise. It sounded like an admission that something didn't fit his laws." Hannah felt her chest tighten, not because romance flared, but because for the first time, someone looked at her and didn't assign her a role where she had to pay for existing. She looked at Gideon, the man the whole restaurant had feared, the name the city avoided saying, and in this moment she saw one thing he shared with her. He stood there like someone who didn't believe he deserved to be touched by anything gentle. Hannah didn't think. She only said what rose from the deepest part of her pain. Sometimes it isn't kindness. Sometimes it's just grief. Looking for somewhere to go. The sentence fell into the air like a small spark. Gideon stared at her for a long moment, as if weighing something more dangerous than any negotiation, weighing the act of believing. Then his phone cut through it. A brief, sharp sound in the wind. Gideon glanced at the screen, his face unchanged but his jaw tightening. He answered without greeting, and on the other end Owen's voice was quick, clipped. No long explanation, only 6 words dropping like a piece of ice. "Rourke's people are watching." And in that moment the wind still blew, the city still shone, but Hannah felt the ground under her shift slightly, because she understood those words weren't ordinary information. They were a warning that last night's silence no longer belonged to the past. It had stepped into the present and was already looking for a way to reach her. When Gideon ended the call, he didn't say much. He only looked at Hannah once, as if deciding how to pull her out of a danger zone she didn't even have a map for yet, then drove her home in a silence that was short and tight, the car rolling through rain-wet streets, traffic lights smearing their colors across the glass like drifting stains. Hannah sat in the back seat, her thoughts slowing, trying to understand Owen's warning, trying to connect the dark car, the nice song text, and the name Calvin Rourke she'd never heard before. But there are things you feel with your skin before your head can explain them. And Hannah's skin was cold. When the car stopped in front of the old building where she rented a small apartment, Gideon didn't get out to walk her up, didn't step into her world. He only gave one short instruction. "Go inside. Lock the door. Don't go alone." His voice wasn't gentle, but it carried the weight of a man used to giving orders to save people. Hannah nodded, hurried up the stairs, and when she looked back down, Gideon's car had already gone as if it had never been there, leaving her with rain and a new kind of silence, the kind that smelled like watching. That night, Hannah slept in fragments, dreamed of the hospital hallway, and jolted awake at the sound of cars on the street. The next morning, she woke earlier than usual, made weak coffee, stood by the window watching the stream of people going to work, trying to convince herself that life was still moving, that last night had only been a strange conversation with a powerful man, that danger was something meant for movies. But when she opened her door to take the trash into the hall, she saw it lying right in front of her doormat. A light brown envelope, no stamp, no return address, placed neatly like a reminder that someone had stood here, right outside her door. Hannah froze. Her heart missed one beat and then slammed back into rhythm. She crouched and picked up the envelope with 2 fingers like it was dirty, carried it inside, shut the door, slid the lock, then leaned her back against the wood as if her legs might not hold. She stared at the envelope for a long time before she dared to tear it open. Inside there was no money, no long letter, only a color photograph. So clear Hannah could see the raindrops on her own coat, could see herself stepping into Gideon's car last night. And what made her go cold wasn't being photographed. It was the red circle drawn straight around her face like a target. Beneath the photo was one typed line, short, clipped, cold as a needle, pretty to look at. Easier to break. Hannah felt her stomach twist, not because she believed she was pretty, but because that line turned her into an object you could hold, you could bend, you could use, She clenched the photo until the paper warped, then let it go as if it burned, her hands shaking. She looked around her small apartment, as if realizing for the first time how thin the walls were, how easy the windows were to break, how easily a life lived alone could be invaded. Her first reflex was to call someone, and the first person who rose in her mind, humiliating but true, was Gideon. Hannah found his number in her recent calls, her finger hovering over the screen as if touching a forbidden place. Then she called. The ring sounded. Once, twice, 3 times, then rolled into voicemail. Hannah hung up and called again. The same. She sent one short text. I got an envelope, then sank into a kitchen chair like all her strength had drained out. At the same time, somewhere else higher and brighter, Gideon received a quick report from Owen. The words short as bullets, even without a gun. Rourke has targeted the girl. He's sent a signal. He wants to see your reaction. Gideon listened, his face unchanged, but his eyes darkening. He understood this was Rourke's game, a way of catching fish by stirring up the water. And if Gideon rushed in, if he appeared beside Hannah like a protector, Rourke would have living proof that she was a weakness. Gideon laid the rules on the table like cold glass pressed over flame. He told Owen in a decisive voice. No one contacts her. No one shows up at her door. No calls, no texts, no trace. We protect from a distance. Owen hesitated slightly, because he knew silence could be a blade that cut deep, but in the end he still answered. Understood. Gideon ended the call, watched his phone light up with Hannah's name, then let it ring until it stopped. He watched her message appear and sit there as sent, and still didn't reply, not because he didn't care, but because he understood that in this world, caring is a lamp, turn it on, and someone shoots straight at it. In the small apartment, Hannah stared at her silent phone, stared at the photograph on the table, stared at the typed line like a cold hand laid on her throat, and in that moment, she understood a truth that made her want to vomit. Tonight was no longer about her singing for a lonely older woman. It had become a chess game, and she was a piece, and the worst part was that she didn't even know when the game had begun. Hannah shoved the envelope and the photo deep into the kitchen drawer as if burying something poisonous, then sat motionless for a long time in her small apartment, listening to the refrigerator hum in its steady way and the footsteps of a neighbor out in the hallway. She'd waited for her phone to buzz again, waited for a short message from Gideon Cross. Even if it was only one word. Okay, even if it was only a period. Just something to prove she hadn't been thrown into the sea alone. But the phone screen kept going dark and bright with meaningless notifications, and his name didn't appear again. That silence didn't feel like the kind of disappearing she was used to. It felt like a door slamming shut right in her face after she'd just managed to glimpse the light inside. Hannah understood she wasn't hurting because of some lightning strike romance. She didn't have anything she could call love. She was hurting because the feeling of being seen had touched her, and then been taken away. Hurting because someone had looked straight into her wound, had asked who taught her to disappear, and then disappeared before she could finish answering. And it reopened an old wound in the cruelest way, as if her whole life had trained her to believe that anyone who comes close will leave, and tonight had proved them right again. That morning, Hannah still went to work, because work was the only thing she knew how to do to keep herself from falling apart. She entered Belamonte through the back door, tied on her apron, pulled the knot tight the way she always did, but today the string didn't feel like armor. It felt like a light noose hanging at her waist. She worked in a hollow state, her eyes on one table while her mind drifted somewhere else, her ears catching customers calling but her heart not responding. The professional smile still sat on her lips like a mask glued in place. Sienna saw it right away, because Sienna always saw. The floor manager came close and asked quietly, "Are you okay?" Hannah tried to say okay, because she always said okay, but the word snagged in her throat. She only nodded, then shook her head, as if her body was too tired to keep lying smoothly. Hannah handled a few more tables, her hands still steady on the tray out of habit, but inside her a crack was spreading, and every time the front door opened, she had a foolish reflex to glance up, hoping to see Gideon sitting in that shadowed corner like yesterday, hoping for some sign he hadn't abandoned her. But the door only brought in ordinary customers, ordinary laughter, ordinary life, and Gideon didn't come. By mid-shift, Hannah felt like she was moving underwater, slow, heavy, struggling to breathe. She set the tray down on the kitchen counter, turned to Sienna, and said very softly, her voice almost gone, Can I go? Today? Sienna looked at her for one beat, didn't interrogate her, only let out a breath like someone who'd expected this, then nodded. Go home. Hannah changed in the staff room, her fingers trembling as she fastened buttons. She stepped out the back door, cold wind slapping her face and clearing her mind for a moment, but not enough to fill the empty space. Back in her apartment, Hannah turned on the kitchen light, the pale yellow falling onto the bare table. She opened the drawer and looked at the photo one more time, then slammed it shut like shutting a poisonous mouth. She stood in the middle of the room, not knowing what to do with the silence inside her. And then her eyes landed on the apron hanging over a chair. Old white fabric with faint coffee stains, the thing that belonged to her steady life, a life that was small but at least it had a rhythm. Hannah walked over, lifted the apron from its hook, and folded it slowly like folding a letter, each crease even, careful, as if making it neat could make the pain smaller. When she finished, she held it for a long time. The softness of the cloth under her fingers reminding her of how her grandmother used to fold towels, used to tell her not to throw anything away when she was sad. But Hannah was tired of always holding on, always enduring, always getting back up. She walked to the trash can, lifted the lid, set the apron on top, and then her hand stopped. She couldn't drop it. Her fingers shook. Her heart hammered as if begging her not to do this, because throwing it away would mean she was abandoning herself before life had time to abandon her. It would mean she was handing back the small part of her that had just been lit, only because she was afraid it would hurt more when it got extinguished. Tears rose even though she didn't want them. Hannah shut her eyes and drew in a breath, but there was nothing to breathe except plastic and soap. She pulled the apron back out of the trash, hugged it to her chest like something foolish but real, then slid down onto the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and cried silently, not because of Gideon, but because the feeling of being seen and then losing it dragged her through every time she'd been set down, and someone turned away. An hour later, Hannah wiped her face, stood up, and with a decision colder than her tears, she opened her phone and texted Sienna that she was quitting Belamonte, not to run from Gideon Cross, but to run from the most dangerous feeling she knew, the feeling of being seen and then erased from someone's sight as if she'd never existed at all. The next day, Hannah didn't go back to Belamonte. She turned off her alarm at the usual time and lay staring at the ceiling like it was a patch of sky with no window, her mind still echoing with the message where she'd quit. A decision that felt both light and heavy. Light because she'd finally cut away the thing that was hurting her. Heavy because she was erasing her own footprints again. She made coffee but didn't finish it, stood by the sink and watched the water run and stop, as if her life was running and stopping in that exact place. Close to noon, there was a knock at the door. Not hard, not hurried, only 3 even taps, patient and steady. Hannah startled, her heart jumping like a frightened bird. She peered through the peephole and saw an older woman standing in the hallway. A beige coat, neatly kept silver hair, eyes slightly reddened as if she'd been crying or had simply lived through a long night. Hannah opened the door a crack and recognized Gideon Cross at once. Gideon's world standing at the threshold of her small apartment, without an entourage, without any show of power, only a gentle weariness that tightened Hannah's throat. Marianne looked at Hannah and spoke immediately. No circling. I'm sorry to bother you, but I don't want you to misunderstand. Hannah didn't know whether to invite her in, but Marianne took one small step on her own, just enough that the cold hallway wouldn't swallow her voice. I know you quit. I know you're scared. And I know you think Gideon abandoned you. Hannah went rigid, because Marianne hit every point as if she'd been watching Hannah's life through glass. Marianne lifted both hands, not pleading, only making sure Hannah understood she hadn't come to force anything. I'm not here to ask you to forgive him, and I'm not here to defend him. I'm here because you deserve the truth. Hannah swallowed and opened the door a little wider, a gesture that felt like surrender. Marianne stepped inside, glanced around quickly, not judging, only taking in the simplicity the way someone who knows what it means to live with little and still keep things clean. Then she stopped near the door, didn't go deeper, respecting the boundary. She looked at Hannah and her voice stayed soft but direct. Gideon disappeared because he was afraid you'd get hurt. Hannah let out a quiet laugh, not a happy one, afraid and disappearing. What good is that? Marianne shook her head, her eyes carrying a sadness she'd lived with for a long time. My son believes anyone who gets close to him will be destroyed. He doesn't believe he can hold anything gentle without breaking it. Hannah heard it and felt a sharp ache in her chest, like someone pressing a bruise she hadn't shown. Marianne went on. No sermon, no long lesson from the past, only what mattered. Gideon lives by his law, that everything has a price. Everything comes with a bill, and if someone gives for free, it's bait. You got too close to something in him that he doesn't know how to protect, so he did what he always does when he's afraid. He pushed you away. Hannah looked at Marianne, wanting to argue that pushing people away hurts them too. But the argument caught in her throat when Marianne added, "His love often takes the worst shape. Sweetheart, he thinks pushing people far away is the only way they survive." Hannah felt her eyes burn, and what hurt wasn't Gideon himself. It was how that sentence sounded like a rule she'd lived her whole life. If I disappear, I'll be safe. If I belong to no one, I won't lose anyone. Marianne saw Hannah's tears and didn't rush to wipe them. She simply stood there like one of the rare adults who didn't demand Hannah be strong right away. Then she said one line that broke Hannah in the gentlest way. "I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm only asking you to understand. He doesn't know how to hold something gentle without crushing it." The words weren't decoration. They weren't an excuse. They were a bare truth laid on the table. And because it was bare, it went deep. Hannah suddenly cried. Not the crying of a girl with a broken crush, but the crying of a child grown up without anyone standing in front of her and saying what she felt was real. That her pain wasn't her fault. That being left behind wasn't because she wasn't worthy. Marianne stepped a little closer, still keeping space, then rested a hand on Hannah's arm lightly, like touching the wing of a frightened bird. "I know you've lived a long time by disappearing. I saw it that night, and I also saw you stop." Hannah hiccuped on a sob and clutched her own sleeve to keep from shaking. Marianne reached into her pocket and pulled out a small slip of paper, an address written in clear handwriting. She handed it to Hannah like a key. "If you ever want answers, go there tonight." Hannah looked at the address, looked at the handwriting, felt her heart begin to pound again, not with sweet hope, but with the fear of taking one more step toward the very thing she'd decided to run from. Marianne looked at her one last time, then turned to the door. No pressure, no promises, leaving only something simple and heavy behind. "You're not a chess piece, Hannah." And when the door closed, Hannah stood in the quiet apartment holding the slip of paper, tears still wet on her face, and for the first time she understood that Gideon's silence didn't have to mean abandonment. Sometimes it was the way a frightened man tried to save someone by hurting them first. And the only question left now was whether Hannah had the courage to go where the answers were waiting. That evening Hannah left her apartment, rain pouring down as if the whole Chicago sky had decided to dump everything it had been holding back, wind slapping water into her face until her eyes burned, her coat turning heavy and cold within minutes. But the slip of paper Marianne had given her stayed in her pocket like a hot coal, pulling her forward even though every step wanted to turn around. The address didn't lead to a glass tower or an iron gate. It was just a quiet street, low houses, bare trees, pale porch lights, the smell of wet dirt and asphalt. A place where, if she hadn't been told, Hannah would never have guessed it belonged to a man like Gideon Cross. She stood under the awning of a closed shop and stared at the row of houses, her heart pounding, not from excitement to see him again, but from fear of every possibility. Fear he wouldn't come, fear he would come to end things, fear she was turning herself into someone pathetic, chasing a shadow. And then she saw him, Gideon, standing in front of an ordinary house. No obvious guards, no showy lighting, just him and the rain. His coat soaked through, his hair wet and sticking slightly to his forehead, water sliding down into his collar, and he didn't shield himself, as if he were letting the weather punish him for the words he didn't know how to say. Hannah walked closer and stopped at a distance that meant neither of them had to touch. Gideon looked at her, his eyes dark but not cold, and there was a tiredness in them that surprised Hannah, like a man who'd slept less than he'd been awake. Hannah kept the paper in her pocket, her fingers tightening around it. She thought she would begin with the envelope, the photo, the dark car, the way he'd left her alone, but what came out first was short and sharp, because if it got longer, she would break. "You disappeared." Gideon gave a small nod. No denial, no excuse, no "you misunderstood," and that was what made Hannah choke with anger, because part of her had wanted it to be a misunderstanding. Gideon spoke before she could add more, his voice low and clean, like a man finally choosing to put the truth on the table. "I stayed away because I wanted you alive more than I wanted you close." The sentence held Hannah still for a beat, because it wasn't romantic. It wasn't an apology the way people apologize. It was the kind of confession a man makes when he's lived in war too long and thinks retreat is the only protection. But Hannah didn't have the strength to accept protection that turned into a cut. She lifted her chin, her eyes wet from rain and from other things, and she said it without softness, without shaking, like a straight line meant to save herself. Then don't come back just to disappear again. Gideon watched her for a long moment, then drew in a breath as if he had to relearn how to breathe around that sentence. He nodded, didn't rush into promises, only said, "I'm not here to tangle you up more. I'm here because my mother was right. You're not a chess piece." Hannah heard the words chess piece and her throat tightened, the red circle on the photo flashing in her mind like ink that wouldn't come off. She said the thing she needed to say or she wouldn't be able to stand. "I'm not stepping into your violence." Gideon didn't move, only listened. Hannah continued, feeling as if she were laying down rules for a man who usually was the rule. "I don't want guns. I don't want blood. I don't want midnight calls. I don't want to have to turn my face away and pretend I don't know what you do." Gideon took it in, with expression unchanged, but his gaze darkening as if he were testing whether he had any right to ask for anything. Hannah went on, "And you don't get to use your power to keep me. You don't get to decide for me. You don't get to turn me into something that has to be put away for safety. Because that isn't safety. That's a cage." Gideon stayed silent, rain striking his shoulders, each drop underlining every word. Then he said, slow and real, "I agree." Hannah didn't believe it right away, because powerful men often agree, and then break the rule anyway. So she held his eyes, looking for the lie. But Gideon added, his voice lower, and for the first time, not steady like an order. "I don't know how." He paused, looking at her as if handing her a kind of authority he'd never handed anyone. "So you'll have to tell me." It wasn't a line. It wasn't seduction. It sounded like an admission of deficit, a small seam opening in the steel. Hannah felt pain bloom in her chest. Not the pain of being left, but the pain of seeing a man like Gideon Cross admit there was something he couldn't control. They stood there in the rain, not touching, not moving closer, only looking at each other across that distance, like looking across a bridge that had just been thrown together in a hurry. And just as Hannah was about to speak, a car rolled slowly past at the end of the street, too slowly to be ordinary. The headlights swept across them like a blade of light, then kept going, leaving a cold line running down Hannah's spine. Gideon didn't turn his head to follow the car, but his shoulders tightened slightly, and Hannah understood the rain wasn't the only thing trailing them tonight. After that rainy night, Gideon didn't turn his agreement into an empty promise. He didn't say the kind of words that would soothe Hannah and then leave her to manage alone. He did what he did best, but in a way Hannah could live with. He compressed danger into a system, not violence on the street. The next morning, Hannah woke with the feeling the rain was still lodged in her bones. She opened the window, saw a gray sky, and saw that she was still alive in a Chicago where everything had suddenly become too real. She didn't go back to Belamonte, not out of fear, but because she was learning how to stay still in a place she chose. Meanwhile, Gideon stepped into a glass conference room high above the city, where everything looked clean, the way a legitimate company looks clean. A large screen showing charts, shipping routes, delivery schedules, contracts that anyone would assume were only business. Owen stood beside him and handed him a thin file. His voice clipped. "Rourke is using a route through the South Port. If you freeze that lane for one day, his partner will panic." Gideon didn't ask why. He only scanned the lines, then lifted his phone and called a number no one dared dial casually. The call lasted only seconds. No threats, no heat, just one sentence so ordinary it was cold. "Freeze that route for legal risk." The voice on the other end said understood. And just like that, a gear inside Rourke's machine jammed without anyone bleeding. Hours later, Owen reported back. Rourke's partner pulled out. They don't want to get dragged into anything that smells like an investigation. Gideon nodded and moved to the next step. He wasn't taking Rourke down with fists. He was taking him down with paperwork. He chose the right person to receive a packet of financial evidence, arranged like a map, leading to a noose that tightened itself. Not a cop with a gun on the street, but someone with the authority to touch banks, licenses, the numbers Rourke's world needed in order to breathe. Gideon told Owen, "Let it tighten on its own. We don't need to get our hands dirty." Owen looked at Gideon as if to say that way is slow, but he understood. Slow is sometimes the deepest cut, and Gideon was choosing the method that fit both his own law and the boundary Hannah had drawn. No blood, but no air either. While the system was slowly closing around Rourke, Hannah got a call from an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Owen's voice came through with his usual polished courtesy. "Miss Hannah, I'd like a few minutes." Hannah looked around her small apartment, as if checking whether someone stood outside her door, then said, "Go ahead." Owen didn't circle the point. He offered a solution that sounded very reasonable. "We can arrange for you to leave Chicago for a few weeks. An apartment somewhere else. Safe, quiet. You won't have to worry about anything." His tone was gentle, like a gift. But Hannah heard another layer, a relocation wrapped in pretty paper. She asked, "Why?" Owen replied, "Because you're being targeted, and because it's too dangerous here." Hannah kept her voice steady, but something inside her began to heat. She knew Owen was partly right, but she also knew that rightness could become a cage. She said, "I'm not luggage." Owen paused, then spoke like he was explaining to a child, "You don't understand the full situation. We only want to protect you." Hannah looked down at her hands, remembered folding her apron and not being able to throw it away, remembered a whole life being moved like a box, from one house to another, one school to another, and for the first time she said it clearly. No tears, no pleading. "I'm not an item you move around for convenience. Where I am is my choice. If you want to protect someone, protect me by stopping the person targeting me. Don't protect me by pushing me away." Owen exhaled, still polite but colder now. "You're putting yourself in danger." Hannah answered, "I've lived in danger in a different way my whole life. At least this time I don't want to disappear because someone else wants me to disappear." The call ended without softness, without shouting, only a hard strip of silence. That afternoon, Owen went to Gideon's office, reported that Hannah refused, and said plainly, "Getting her out of here is still the cleanest option." Gideon stood with his back to the window, the city below moving like a running animal. He was quiet long enough. Owen thought he agreed. Then Gideon turned around, his voice low and final. "No." Owen's brow tightened. Because Gideon's decisions had never been crowded by feeling before, he said, "She doesn't understand." Gideon cut him off. "She understands too well. And she's right." That stopped Owen. Because it was the first time he'd heard Gideon take the side of someone outside their world, in front of his own right-hand man. Gideon continued, "I promised I wouldn't use power to keep her. And I won't use power to push her away either. We handle Rourke. We don't handle Hannah." Owen looked at Gideon. Not angry, only darker, like a warning that softness has a price. He replied very quietly, as if reminding himself, "Yes, but the game isn't over." Then left in silence, the door closing gently, but in the quiet that followed, Gideon understood he'd just put a crack into the old order, and in this world, every crack gets seen by someone. The days after that moved like a rope pulled tight, and then slowly allowed to loosen, not because danger vanished, but because it was pushed farther from Hannah's reach in ways she couldn't see. Calls that never spoke her name, numbers quietly rerouted, doors closing on Calvin Rourke without a single bullet. Hannah kept living in her small apartment, kept taking temporary jobs to keep the money coming, no longer walking into Belamonte every day but sometimes passing by, looking at the warm yellow light inside the way you look at a memory that hurts and warms at the same time. Gideon didn't force her back, didn't send flowers, didn't use power to manufacture a pretty story. He only showed up when it mattered, like a shadow at the edge, so she could stand in the middle on her own. And then one evening, when the wind had softened, Hannah received a text from Marianne, short and simple. "Are you free tonight? I want dinner at Belamonte." Hannah stared at the screen for a long time, felt her heart beat in a way that wasn't panic anymore but still trembled. She knew this was the destination of the motif that had started everything, and she also knew that if she went back there, she'd have to face the deepest fear inside her, the fear of being seen, the fear of being named. But this time she didn't want to run. She changed clothes, brushed her hair, walked toward the restaurant under the streetlights, and went in through the front door instead of circling to the back. A small change that made her draw a deep breath as if she were learning how to breathe again. Belamonte was the same, the scent of butter and baked bread, the soft clink of glass, voices flowing like small rivers. But to Hannah, everything felt less sharp, less threatening, as if she herself had changed the sensitivity of the world. Sienna saw her and held her gaze for a moment. didn't say much, only nodded once like recognition, then led her to the reserved table. Marianne was there, beige coat, scarf neat, her eyes brighter than the first time Hannah had met her, and beside her wasn't emptiness, but a chair with someone in it. Gideon Cross sat at a distance from Marianne that kept her from being eclipsed by his power. He didn't claim the center, didn't make anyone look. He let his mother be the center. Like a son finally learning that love sometimes looks like stepping back, Hannah approached and Marianne reached for her hand first. Warm fingers, trembling slightly, as if holding on to a thread that had almost slipped away. "You came," Marianne said, her voice soft, not making Hannah feel indebted. Hannah sat down with the feeling she was stepping into old ground. Only this time, there was no trap. Gideon gave a brief greeting, and his eyes weren't the cold measuring line they'd been the first night. They were calm and deep, like a man who'd seen how terrified she was and still chose not to use it. The meal was simple. Marianne told small stories, about a book she'd been reading, about an old piece of music, about how she'd grown used to blowing out candles alone for years, and still forced a smile. Hannah listened, and felt her throat tighten. Gideon occasionally asked his mother if she needed anything, his voice low, not controlling, and the less he performed, the more trustworthy he became in a strange way. When dessert came, Sienna herself carried out a small plate of cake. No one had to ask. She set it in front of Marianne, and on top was one candle, this time not lonely, the flame standing steadier, as if it knew it no longer had to wait alone. Marianne looked at the candle and her eyes went red immediately, but the smile was there too. Relieved, not the smile of someone forcing herself through. Hannah rose before anyone could suggest it. Not because she wanted to be the main character, but because she understood this moment didn't belong to power or fear. It belonged to an older woman being remembered. Hannah looked at Marianne, then looked at Gideon, asking for a silent permission. Gideon didn't nod or shake his head. He only slid his chair back slightly, stood, and stepped aside, making space for Hannah and his mother as if he were putting his power away in his pocket. Hannah turned back to Marianne, drew a breath, and sang. The Spanish came again, but it wasn't the voice of a frightened girl apologizing for arriving late to her own life. It was the voice of someone choosing to stay inside this moment, choosing not to disappear, choosing to look straight at the candle and say through music, "I see you, and this time I'm not going anywhere." Marianne began to cry, tears falling without hurry, as if she'd waited a lifetime to cry because she was with someone, not because she'd been left behind. When Hannah finished, she fell quiet. She didn't lower her head to apologize, didn't rush away. She simply stood there and breathed, feeling warmth spread from one small flame and one large gaze. Gideon watched her, and in his look, there was no longer the question of keeping or erasing, no longer the calculation of advantage, only a slow learning to believe that some things don't come with a bill, that sometimes a song is only a song, and sometimes a person stops simply because they don't want someone to be lonely. Hannah sat down again, her hands steady, her heart still trembling but no longer panicked, and when Marianne blew out the candle to a small wave of applause, Hannah realized what had changed most wasn't Gideon's world, it was her. Being seen wasn't frightening anymore, because this time she wasn't standing alone in the light. After that second candlelit evening, Hannah's life didn't suddenly turn into a fairy tale. It only changed in a quiet, lasting way, like an old lock being oiled until it finally agrees to open. She still lived in her small apartment, still paid her rent herself, still made her own coffee in the morning, still walked through windy Chicago streets. But one thing was completely different. She no longer used the back door just so she wouldn't be remembered. When she went back to Belamonte for part-time shifts, she walked in through the front entrance, greeted Sienna, greeted the kitchen, even greeted the people who once didn't know her name. Not to draw attention, but to admit to herself that she had the right to exist where there was light. Gideon kept his word in a way few people could see but Hannah could feel. He protected without imprisoning. He stayed at the edge instead of standing in the center. He didn't turn her into a public target. Didn't pull her into meetings where she would have to wear a role that didn't fit. The danger around Calvin Rourke was compressed inside the system until it quietly disappeared from Hannah's path, without her ever having to witness anything violent. And when Hannah asked, Gideon only said, briefly, "It's done." Like a promise carried out in silence, Marianne became a rare pocket of peace inside that hard world. She called to ask if Hannah had eaten. sent her simple recipes, sometimes texted only one short Spanish line to remind her that today she was still here. And Hannah began to believe that family isn't always something you're born into. Sometimes it's something you choose through patience and kindness. On an ordinary morning, Hannah opened a kitchen cabinet and saw Marianne's Spanish thank you note taped neatly inside. The handwriting slightly blurred with time, but the meaning clearer than ever. "You reminded me that I'm still here." Hannah touched the paper lightly, as if touching proof that she wasn't invisible anymore, that her story had been named, and this time she'd arrived in time for a candle, for a moment, for herself. The lesson of this story isn't about power or wealth. It's about something far simpler. Sometimes a small act like stopping, like lifting a song, like offering gratitude at the right moment, can save a heart from loneliness. And sometimes the strongest person isn't the one who makes an entire room afraid. It's the one who learns not to crush gentle things when they touch them. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel, like and share to support us. So each day you can listen to more compelling, meaningful stories. And how do you feel about Hannah and Gideon's story? Have you ever experienced being seen and then forgotten? Or had one small moment change the way you look at life? Leave a comment and share what you feel from the deepest part of your heart, because real-life stories are what help us understand that everyone has a candle that needs to be kept from going out. Goodbye and see you in the next video. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, joyful days, and peaceful life. Goodbye and see you again in the next video.